Echoes of great loss. Rosie Boone had always been warned about men like Jack Mercer, drifters with silver tongues and hands that knew too much. But when he pulled her into the alley behind the saloon, his hands rough and knowing, she forgot every warning. He smirked, his breath warm against her ear. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured. "And I just might take it as an invitation." Chapter 1. A Kiss Before Sundown. The dust swirled around Rosie Boone's worn leather boots, a miniature, rust-colored tornado mirroring the tempest brewing inside her. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows from the weathered buildings of Redemption, Arizona, a town clinging precariously to life on the edge of the vast, unforgiving desert. It was a town of hard-won second chances and buried, sometimes bloody, first mistakes. Rosie, at 57, had seen enough of both. She adjusted the worn brim of her hat, shielding her eyes not just from the sun, but from the lingering gaze of the man leaning against the hitching post across the street. Jack Mercer. Even his name tasted dangerous, like cheap whiskey and gunpowder. He was everything her late husband, Samuel, had warned her about: a drifter, a man with eyes that saw too much and hands that probably knew even more. A man who carried the scent of trouble like a second skin. Rosie had run the Rusty Spur Saloon since Samuel's passing 5 years prior, a legacy of their shared dream, now a bittersweet reminder of a life cut short by a stray bullet during a card game gone wrong. She'd learned to navigate the rough and tumble world of saloon keeping, her soft-spoken demeanor masking a core of steel forged in the crucible of frontier life. She could pour a shot of whiskey, break up a brawl, and mend a torn shirt with equal dexterity, her hands calloused but surprisingly gentle. Her life was predictable, etched in the routines of sunup to sundown, the clinking of glasses, and the murmur of lonely men seeking solace in the bottom of a bottle. Predictable, that was, until Jack Mercer had ridden into town 3 weeks ago. He hadn't caused any trouble, not directly. He kept to himself, mostly, nursing a single drink for hours, his dark eyes scanning the room, always watchful, always present. He had a way of making his presence felt without saying a word, a subtle magnetism that drew the eye and unsettled the soul. And Rosie, despite her best intentions, found her gaze drawn to him more often than she cared to admit. It wasn't just his looks, though he was undeniably striking. Tall and lean, with a weathered face framed by dark, unruly hair streaked with silver at the temples. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a depth of experience, a hint of sadness that resonated with a hidden part of her own heart. It was the way he moved, with a quiet grace that belied the coiled strength beneath his worn denim shirt and leather vest. The way he held himself, as if carrying the weight of the world on his broad shoulders, yet still managing to stand tall. This evening, however, the air between them crackled with something more. She'd caught him watching her, his gaze lingering on her face, her hands as she wiped down the bar, her figure as she moved between tables. It was a look that stripped away the years, the layers of grief and responsibility, leaving her feeling exposed, vulnerable and strangely alive. She tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as the foolish fancy of a lonely woman. But the memory of that first, unexpected encounter still burned in her mind. It had been a week ago, just after closing. She'd been locking up the back door of the saloon, the alley shrouded in shadows. He'd stepped out of the darkness, startling her. He hadn't said a word, just looked at her, his eyes intense in the dim light. She'd instinctively reached for the small pistol she kept tucked in her apron pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs. But he hadn't made any threatening move. He'd simply raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture of peace. "Just admiring the stars, ma'am," he'd said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "Beautiful night." She'd lowered the pistol, her hand still trembling. "You shouldn't sneak up on a woman like that, Mr. Mercer." He'd given her a slow, knowing smile.
"Apologies, ma'am.
"Didn't mean to startle you." He had stepped closer, and the memory of what had transpired then had haunted the perimeters of Rosie's awareness ever since. He had pulled her into the narrow space between the wall and his hard body, the suddenness of it stealing her breath. His hands, rough and calloused, had found the curve of her waist, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. She should have pushed him away, should have screamed, but she hadn't. She'd been frozen, mesmerized by the intensity of his gaze, the raw, untamed energy that radiated from him. He'd smirked, a flash of white teeth in the darkness, his breath warm against her ear. "You keep looking at me like that, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice a silken thread, "and I just might take it as an invitation." The implied invitation hung in the air between them, thick and heavy with unspoken desire. She'd finally found her voice, a shaky whisper. "An invitation to what, Mr. Mercer?" He hadn't answered, just leaned closer, his lips brushing against her earlobe. "To find out," he'd whispered, before releasing her and stepping back into the shadows, leaving her breathless and trembling in the cool night air. Now, standing in the fading light of the setting sun, she felt that same tremor of anticipation, of fear, of something she hadn't felt in years. Something dangerous and exhilarating. She knew she should walk away, should go back inside the saloon and busy herself with the evening's preparations. But she couldn't. She was drawn to him, like a moth to a flame, knowing the danger, yet unable to resist the pull. He pushed himself away from the hitching post and started walking towards her, his stride slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on hers. The street was almost deserted, the few remaining townsfolk hurrying home before nightfall. The only sound was the creak of the saloon sign swaying in the gentle breeze and the pounding of her own heart. As he drew closer, she could see the details of his face more clearly, the lines etched around his eyes, the faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the stubble that shadowed his jaw. He stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of leather, horses, and something else, something uniquely him. "Evening, Rosie," he said, his voice low and smooth, like aged whiskey. She swallowed, trying to steady her racing pulse. "Mr. Mercer." He tilted his head, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You gonna keep calling me that? Makes me feel old." "And what should I call you?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Jack," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Just Jack." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple. The shadows deepened, blurring the lines between them, between right and wrong, between caution and desire. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. He took another step, and this time Rosie was not sure if she had the strength or the will to move away. Chapter 2. The Whispers of Redemption. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant howl of a coyote and the rhythmic creak of the saloon's swinging doors. Rosie felt the weight of Jack's gaze, a palpable pressure that seemed to strip away the years, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. She was no longer the hardened saloon owner, but a woman, with all the longings and desires she thought she'd buried long ago. "Jack," she repeated, the name feeling unfamiliar, yet strangely intimate on her tongue. It was a step, a small one, but a step nonetheless, across the invisible line that separated them. He nodded, a flicker of something that might have been approval in his eyes. "Better," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "Much better." He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly near her arm, as if unsure whether to touch her. The gesture was surprisingly gentle, considering the roughness of his appearance, the hint of danger that clung to him like a second skin. Rosie held her breath, her senses heightened, acutely aware of the warmth radiating from his body, the faint scent of dust and leather that clung to his clothes. He didn't touch her, not yet. Instead, he let his hand drop back to his side. "Walk with me, Rosie," he said, his voice softer now, almost a plea. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a command either. It was an invitation, a request, a subtle acknowledgement of her agency, her right to choose. And, against her better judgment, against all the warnings that echoed in her mind, she found herself nodding. They walked in silence, side by side, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust of the street. The town was slowly coming to life as the evening coolness settled in. Lanterns flickered in the windows of the few remaining businesses, casting pools of warm light onto the dusty street. The faint sound of music drifted from the Golden Nugget, a rival saloon on the other side of town, a reminder of the constant competition for survival in this harsh, unforgiving land. Rosie glanced at Jack, studying his profile in the fading light. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw tight. She wondered what demons haunted him, what secrets he carried beneath that stoic exterior. He was a mystery, an enigma, a man who seemed to have walked straight out of the pages of a dime novel, yet with a depth of feeling that hinted at a past far more complex than any fictional tale. "Why are you here, Jack?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question had been brewing inside her since he'd first arrived in Redemption, a persistent itch she couldn't ignore. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on the distance. They walked past the weathered storefront of the general store, the closed doors of the blacksmith shop, the empty corral where a few horses stood huddled together, their heads drooping with exhaustion. The town felt deserted, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Running," he said, the single word hanging heavy in the air. Rosie waited, sensing there was more to the story. He glanced at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Running from what?" He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "From everything, I suppose. From the past. From myself." His words resonated with a hidden pain that mirrored her own. She knew what it was like to run, to try to escape the ghosts of the past, the memories that clung to you like shadows, refusing to be shaken off. She'd spent years running from the pain of Samuel's death, from the emptiness that had settled in her heart, from the fear of ever loving and losing again. "We all have things we run from, Jack," she said softly, her voice laced with a shared understanding. He stopped walking, turning to face her. The light from a nearby lantern illuminated his face, highlighting the lines etched around his eyes, the faint scar that bisected his eyebrow. He looked older than she'd first thought, his face bearing the marks of a life lived hard, a life filled with hardship and regret. "Some things," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you can never outrun." His words struck a chord deep within her, a raw, exposed nerve. She knew he was right. The past was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to resurface, to remind you of what you'd lost, of what you could never have again. He reached out, this time his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "But maybe," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "maybe sometimes you can find a reason to stop running." His eyes searched hers, a silent question hanging in the air between them. A question that mirrored her own unspoken longing, her own desperate hope for something more than the lonely existence she'd carved out for herself. A hope for a second chance, a chance at redemption, a chance at love. A sudden commotion erupted from the direction of the Golden Nugget, shattering the fragile moment. Shouts, followed by the sound of breaking glass and the thud of fists on flesh. Jack's hand dropped from her cheek, his body instantly alert, his eyes scanning the street. The spell was broken, the intimacy replaced by a shared awareness of the ever-present danger that lurked in the shadows of redemption. He was no longer the man offering a fragile hope of something more. He was a gunslinger, a man of the West. He turned to face the disturbance, his body coiled and ready. The whispers of the town, and perhaps her own heart, would have to wait. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. The sounds of the brawl spilled out from the Golden Nugget, a raucous symphony of shouts, curses, and the splintering of wood. Jack's hand instinctively moved towards the Colt Peacemaker strapped to his hip, his body tense, his eyes narrowed, assessing the threat. Rosie, despite her years in the saloon business, felt a familiar knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Violence was a constant companion in Redemption, a shadow that lurked just beneath the surface of everyday life. "Stay here," Jack said, his voice low and firm, his gaze still fixed on the golden nugget. He didn't wait for her response, already moving towards the commotion, his long strides eating up the distance. Rosie, however, didn't stay put. She wasn't a helpless damsel, waiting to be rescued. She was a survivor, a woman who had learned to face danger head-on. She followed Jack, keeping a safe distance, her hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol she kept hidden in the folds of her skirt. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As they approached the golden nugget, the scene that unfolded before them was one of chaotic violence. Tables were overturned, chairs were smashed, and men were locked in a brutal, free-for-all brawl. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, whiskey, and blood. Jack moved with a practiced ease, weaving through the melee, his eyes searching for the source of the trouble. He wasn't looking for a fight, not yet, but he wasn't afraid to defend himself if necessary. He had a code, a sense of justice that had been honed over years of living on the edge of the law. Rosie spotted the instigator almost immediately. A burly man with a scarred face and a cruel sneer was standing over a smaller man, his fist raised, ready to deliver another blow. The smaller man was cowering on the floor, his face bloodied, his eyes filled with terror. "Bartlett!" Rosie shouted, her voice surprisingly loud and commanding, cutting through the din of the fight. "That's enough." The burly man, Bartlett, turned towards her, his sneer widening. He was a known troublemaker, a bully who preyed on the weak and vulnerable. He'd been a thorn in Rosie's side since he'd arrived in Redemption, constantly causing problems in her saloon and harassing her customers. Well, Bartlett drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If it ain't the Widow Boone. Come to join the party?" He took a step towards her, his eyes filled with menace. Rosie stood her ground, her hand tightening around the pistol in her skirt. She wasn't afraid of Bartlett, not anymore. She'd faced down tougher men than him. But before she could react, Jack stepped in front of her, blocking Bartlett's path. He stood tall and imposing, his presence radiating a quiet authority that made even Bartlett hesitate. "Leave her alone," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous, his eyes locked on Bartlett's. Bartlett scoffed, trying to regain his bravado. "And who's gonna make me, Drifter?" Jack didn't answer, just stood there, his silence more threatening than any words. The tension in the air was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. The other men in the saloon, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, gradually stopped fighting, their attention drawn to the standoff between Jack and Bartlett. The room fell silent, except for the heavy breathing of the combatants and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Bartlett, realizing he was losing face, shifted his weight, his hand moving towards the gun strapped to his hip. "You got a problem, Drifter?" he growled. Jack's eyes flickered towards Bartlett's hand, then back to his face. "I don't have a problem," he said, his voice calm and steady.
"But you're about to."
The moment stretched, taut and tense, the outcome hanging in the balance. Rosie held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that a single wrong move could ignite the situation, turning the saloon into a bloodbath. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the doorway. "What in tarnation is going on here?" Sheriff Thompson, a tall, imposing man with a weathered face and a stern gaze, stood in the entrance, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. He surveyed the scene, his eyes taking in the overturned tables, the broken chairs, and the bruised and battered men. The tension in the room eased slightly, but the underlying animosity remained. Sheriff Thompson was a fair man, but he was also a stickler for the law. He wouldn't tolerate any trouble in his town. "Bartlett," the sheriff said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Explain yourself." Bartlett, realizing he was outmatched, tried to play the victim. "This Drifter," he said, pointing at Jack, "he started it. He attacked me for no reason." Jack didn't say anything, just stood there, his eyes fixed on Bartlett. Rosie knew he wouldn't defend himself, wouldn't stoop to Bartlett's level. "That's a lie, Sheriff," Rosie said, stepping forward. Bartlett was beating up that poor man. She pointed to the cowering figure on the floor, and Jack intervened to stop him. Sheriff Thompson looked at the injured man, then at Jack, then back at Bartlett. He knew Bartlett was a liar, but he also needed proof. "Anyone else see what happened?" he asked, his gaze sweeping across the room. The other men in the saloon, intimidated by Bartlett's reputation, remained silent. Rosie felt a surge of frustration. She knew the truth, but she couldn't prove it. Then, a voice spoke from the back of the room. "She's telling the truth, Sheriff." A young man, a bartender at the Golden Nugget, stepped forward, his face pale but determined.
I saw the whole thing.
Bartlett was picking on that fella, and the drifter, he nodded towards Jack. He just stepped in to protect him. Sheriff Thompson looked at the young man, then at Bartlett. He knew the bartender was telling the truth. He'd always suspected Bartlett was a troublemaker, and now he had confirmation. "Bartlett," the sheriff said, his voice cold and hard. "You're under arrest." Bartlett's face turned red with rage. He opened his mouth to protest, but the sheriff cut him off. "Don't make this any harder than it has to be, Bartlett," he said, his hand tightening on his revolver. Bartlett, realizing he was defeated, reluctantly allowed the sheriff to take him into custody. As he was being led away, he glared at Jack, his eyes filled with hatred. "This ain't over, drifter," he snarled. "I'll get you for this." Jack didn't respond, just watched him go, his face expressionless. The shadows of a past life, a past filled with violence and retribution, flickered across his features. Rosie, watching him, felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that Bartlett's threat was not an idle one. The past, it seemed, had a way of catching up, even in a town called Redemption. And she had a sinking feeling that she was now caught in the middle of it. Chapter 4. The Price of Freedom. The aftermath of the saloon brawl left a lingering tension in the air, a palpable unease that settled over Redemption like a shroud. Even after Bartlett was hauled off to jail, the whispers followed Jack and Rosie, a mix of gratitude and suspicion. Some saw Jack as a hero, a man who stood up to a bully. Others saw him as a troublemaker, a drifter who brought violence with him wherever he went. Rosie, walking back to the rusty spur with Jack beside her, felt the weight of those whispers, the unspoken questions that hung in the air. She knew that her association with Jack, however innocent, would be scrutinized, judged, and likely condemned by some. She was, after all, the Widow Boone, a respectable woman with a reputation to uphold. "Thank you," she said quietly, breaking the silence between them, "for what you did back there." Jack glanced at her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Wasn't nothing," he said, his voice a low rumble. But it wasn't nothing. It was a deliberate act of courage, a willingness to risk his own safety to protect a stranger. And it had revealed a glimpse of the man beneath the stoic exterior, a man with a sense of justice, a code of honor that he lived by. It was something, Rosie insisted. "Bartlett's a dangerous man. He won't forget this." Jack shrugged, his expression unconcerned. "He's just a blowhard. All bark and no bite." But Rosie knew better. She'd seen the hatred in Bartlett's eyes, the promise of revenge that lingered in his parting words. She knew that this wasn't over, that the shadows of the past had been stirred, and the consequences were yet to be seen. They reached the rusty spur, the familiar scent of stale beer and sawdust greeting them as they stepped inside. The saloon was quiet, only a few customers lingering at the bar, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting towards Jack and Rosie. Rosie went behind the bar, her movements automatic, her mind still racing with the events of the evening. She poured Jack a whiskey, pushing the glass across the counter towards him. "On the house," she said, her voice a little shaky. He took the glass, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her. He raised the glass in a silent toast, his eyes holding hers. "To freedom," he said, his voice low and husky. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Freedom from the past, freedom from fear, freedom to choose their own path. It was a concept that resonated deeply with both of them, a shared longing for something more than the lives they'd been living. He took a sip of the whiskey, his gaze never leaving hers. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "you're a brave woman, Rosie Boone." She scoffed, a self-deprecating smile on her lips. "I'm just a saloon owner, trying to make a living. You're more than that, he said, his voice firm. You're strong, resilient, and you have a good heart. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. His words warmed her, a balm to the wounds of the past, the doubts that had plagued her for years. She'd always felt like an outsider, a woman trying to survive in a man's world, constantly having to prove herself. But Jack saw something in her, something she hadn't even seen in herself. What about you, Jack? She asked, her voice curious. What are you running from? He hesitated, his gaze shifting away, his jaw tightening. The shadows returned to his eyes, the ghosts of the past haunting him once more. It's a long story, he said, his voice evasive. I have time, she said, her voice gentle, encouraging. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decide whether to trust her. He took another sip of his whiskey, his hand trembling slightly. I was a lawman, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A Texas Ranger. The words hung in the air, a revelation that changed everything. He wasn't just a drifter, a gunslinger. He was a man of the law, a man who had once upheld justice, protected the innocent. But something had happened, something that had forced him to leave that life behind, to run from his past. What happened? Rosie asked, her voice filled with concern. He closed his eyes, his face etched with pain. I made a mistake, he said, his voice raw with emotion. A mistake that cost the lives of innocent people. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. I was tracking a gang of outlaws, led by a man named Silas Blackwood. He was a ruthless killer, a man without a conscience. I was obsessed with bringing him to justice, with stopping him before he could hurt anyone else. He paused, taking a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists. I pushed too hard, took too many risks. I led my men into an ambush. They were all killed, and Blackwood escaped. The story spilled out of him, a torrent of guilt and regret. He blamed himself for the deaths of his men, for the escape of Blackwood. He'd carried that burden for years, the weight of it crushing him, driving him to run, to hide from the world. Rosie reached across the bar, placing her hand over his. His skin was warm and rough, his hand trembling beneath hers. She felt a surge of empathy for him, a deep understanding of his pain. It wasn't your fault, Jack, she said softly. You were doing your job, trying to protect people. He shook his head, his eyes filled with self-loathing. I should have been more careful. I should have known better. We all make mistakes, Jack, she said, her voice firm. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. We can find a way to move forward, to find redemption. Her words, spoken with such conviction, seemed to reach him, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. He looked at her, his gaze filled with gratitude, with a hint of something more. The price of his freedom, he realized, might just be the willingness to finally stop running. And he knew, with a certainty that surprised even him, that Rosie Boone might be the one person who could help him do that. The saloon doors creaked open, and he knew, instinctively, that this quiet moment, this shared understanding, was about to be interrupted. Chapter 5. Between Law and Loyalty. The saloon doors swung open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the dim light of the street. It was Jed, Rosie's longtime swamper, his face etched with worry, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He was a gentle giant, a man of few words, but fiercely loyal to Rosie and the Rusty Spur Rosie, Jed said, his voice a low rumble, his gaze flickering towards Jack, then back to Rosie. There's trouble. Rosie felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She knew that Jed wouldn't interrupt them unless it was serious. What is it, Jed? Jed hesitated, his gaze shifting back to Jack, as if unsure whether to speak in front of him. Rosie understood his concern. Jack was still a stranger, an unknown quantity, despite the connection that had formed between them. It's Bartlett, Jed said, his voice barely above a whisper. He's out. Rosie's heart sank. Out? How? Bailed out, Jed explained. Someone paid his bail. A lot of money. Rosie felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that Bartlett wouldn't waste any time seeking revenge. And she had a sinking feeling that Jack was the primary target. Who paid his bail? Rosie asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Jed shrugged, his face grim. Don't know. Nobody's saying. But word is it was someone connected.
Connected.
The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. It suggested that Bartlett had powerful allies, people who could pull strings, manipulate the law, and make life difficult for anyone who crossed them. Jack, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice calm and steady. Silas Blackwood, he said, the name a whisper of dread. Rosie looked at him, her eyes widening in realization. Blackwood? The outlaw you were tracking? Jack nodded, his jaw tight. He's got connections everywhere. He's got men in every town, every territory. He's probably the one who bailed Bartlett out. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, revealing a dangerous picture. Bartlett wasn't just a local bully, he was a pawn in a much larger game, a game orchestrated by a ruthless outlaw with a vendetta against Jack. And Rosie, by her association with Jack, was now caught in the crossfire. Why would Blackwood bail out Bartlett? Rosie asked, her voice trembling slightly. To get to me, Jack said, his voice grim. He knows I'm here. He knows I interfered with Bartlett. He's sending a message. The message was clear, stay out of my way, or face the consequences. But Jack wasn't the kind of man to back down from a threat. He'd spent years hunting Blackwood, and he wasn't about to let him win now. What are you going to do? Rosie asked, her voice filled with concern. Jack met her gaze, his eyes dark and determined. I'm going to finish what I started, he said, his voice firm. I'm going to bring Blackwood to justice. His words were a declaration of war, a commitment to a dangerous path that could lead to his death. Rosie felt a surge of conflicting emotions, fear for his safety, admiration for his courage, and a growing sense of protectiveness towards him. You can't do this alone, Jack, she said, her voice pleading. Blackwood is too powerful. He has too many men. Jack smiled, a sad, wistful smile. I've been alone for a long time, Rosie, he said, his voice soft. I'm used to it. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had Rosie, and he had Jed. They might not be much of an army, but they were loyal, and they were willing to stand by him, no matter the cost. This was a stark reminder of the world that existed outside. A life of badges, outlaws, and the thin line of loyalty. You're not alone, Rosie said, her voice firm. We're with you. Jed nodded in agreement, his eyes filled with determination. We'll help you, Jack, he said, his voice a low rumble. We'll do whatever it takes. Jack looked at them, his gaze filled with gratitude, with a hint of surprise. He'd been a loner for so long, he'd forgotten what it was like to have people on his side, people who cared about him, people who were willing to risk their lives for him. He was a man who had lived by the law, and for a moment he found himself on the wrong side of it. Sheriff Thompson walked in, his face an unreadable mask. He was flanked by 2 deputies. Jack knew this was the beginning of many things, and none boded well. It was a stark reminder of the precarious balance between law and loyalty, a balance that was about to be tested. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Canyon. Sheriff Thompson's arrival cast a pall over the rusty spur. The few remaining patrons quickly finished their drinks and slipped out, leaving the saloon eerily silent. The air was thick with tension, the unspoken question hanging heavy. What was the sheriff going to do? Evening, Rosie, Thompson said, his voice neutral, his gaze sweeping over Jack, then back to Rosie.
Jed.
He acknowledged the swamper with a curt nod. Sheriff, Rosie replied, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. She knew Thompson was a fair man, but he was also a stickler for the law. And Jack, despite his past as a lawman, was now a wanted man, a fugitive from justice, at least in the eyes of some. I need to talk to you, Mercer, Thompson said, his gaze settling on Jack. Alone. Rosie felt a surge of protectiveness towards Jack. She didn't want him to face the sheriff alone, unarmed, and potentially vulnerable. Anything you need to say to Jack, you can say in front of me, Rosie said, her voice firm, her hand instinctively moving to rest on the bar, near the hidden pistol she kept there. Thompson hesitated, his eyes studying Rosie, assessing her resolve. He knew she was a woman of her word, a woman who wouldn't back down. "All right, Rosie," he said, his voice grudgingly accepting.
"But keep out of this."
"This is between me and Mercer." He turned his attention back to Jack. "Bartlett's claiming you attacked him without provocation," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He's pressing charges. Assault and battery." Jack didn't respond, just stood there, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on Thompson. He knew it was a setup, a fabricated charge designed to put him behind bars, to make him an easy target for Blackwood's men. "That's a lie, Sheriff," Rosie said, her voice rising in anger. "Bartlett was the one who started it. He was beating up a man, and Jack intervened to stop him." Thompson sighed, his face weary. "I know, Rosie," he said, his voice softer now. "I believe you. But I have to follow the law. Bartlett has filed a complaint, and I have to investigate." "Investigate?" Rosie scoffed. "You know Bartlett's a liar. You know he's connected to Blackwood." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about Blackwood?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Jack told me," Rosie said, her gaze meeting Jack's. "He told me everything." Thompson looked at Jack, his expression unreadable. He knew about Jack's past, about his pursuit of Blackwood. He knew that Jack was a dangerous man, but he also knew that he was a man of honor, a man who wouldn't lie about something like this. "I have a warrant for your arrest, Mercer," Thompson said, his voice heavy with regret. "For the assault on Bartlett, and for other matters." "Other matters." The words hung in the air, a veiled reference to Jack's past, to the charges that had forced him to flee Texas. Rosie knew that those charges were serious, that they could carry a heavy penalty. Jack didn't flinch, didn't protest. He simply nodded, his face resigned. "I understand, Sheriff," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm sorry, Jack," Thompson said, his voice genuinely remorseful. "I wish it didn't have to be this way." He motioned to his deputies, who stepped forward, their hands hovering near their guns. Rosie felt a surge of panic. She couldn't let them take Jack, couldn't let him face Blackwood's wrath alone. "Wait," she said, her voice desperate. "There has to be another way." Thompson looked at her, his expression sympathetic. "There isn't, Rosie," he said, his voice firm. "The law is the law." But Rosie wasn't ready to give up. She knew that Jack was innocent, that he was being framed, and she was willing to do whatever it took to protect him. She reached under the bar, her hand closing around the cold steel of the pistol. She pulled it out, her movements quick and decisive. "I won't let you take him," she said, her voice trembling but firm, her eyes locked on Thompson's. The sheriff's eyes widened in surprise, his hand instinctively moving towards his own gun. His deputies followed suit, their weapons drawn, their faces tense. The saloon was silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the people inside. The tension was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. A standoff. A widow, a sheriff, 2 deputies, and a former Texas Ranger. Jack looked at Rosie, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock, admiration, and fear. He knew she was putting herself in danger, risking her own life to protect him. Before Jack could formulate a response, the sound echoed. Not within the saloon, but out in the distance, a place familiar to Jack. The canyon. He knew those lands. He knew the echoes.
Gunfire.
Multiple shots. "That's coming from the North Canyon," Jack said, his voice urgent, all eyes turning to him. "Sounds like trouble." Sheriff Thompson, despite the situation, instinctively reacted. He was, after all, the law and redemption. "Deputies, with me," he ordered, holstering his own weapon. "Rosie, you stay put." He didn't wait for her response, rushing out of the saloon, his deputies close behind. Jack hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on Rosie, a silent question in his eyes. He knew what he had to do. The echoes of the canyon were a call he couldn't ignore. Chapter 7. The Unforgiving Land. The sound of gunfire from the North Canyon hung in the air, a stark reminder of the ever-present danger that permeated the frontier. Rosie, still holding the pistol, watched as Sheriff Thompson and his deputies disappeared into the gathering dusk, their figures swallowed by the shadows. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief that Jack hadn't been arrested, fear for the sheriff and his deputies, and a growing sense of unease about what awaited them in the canyon. Jack turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "I have to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "That's Blackwood's territory. He's up to something." Rosie knew he was right. The gunfire was too close, too deliberate, to be anything but a deliberate act of aggression. And she knew that Jack wouldn't be able to stand by and do nothing, not while Blackwood was out there, causing chaos and threatening innocent lives. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice firm, her grip tightening on the pistol. Jack hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He knew it was dangerous, that she could be killed. But he also knew that she wouldn't be deterred, that her loyalty to him was unwavering. "It's too risky, Rosie," he said, his voice pleading. "I can't let you put yourself in danger." "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his. "I've faced danger before. And I'm not going to let you face Blackwood alone." He knew she meant it. He saw the determination in her eyes, the unwavering resolve that had sustained her through years of hardship and loss. He knew that he couldn't dissuade her, that she was as stubborn as he was. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "But stay close to me, and do exactly what I say." She nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She knew that she was stepping into a dangerous world, a world of outlaws and gunfights, a world where life was cheap and death was always close at hand. But she was ready. She was Rosie Boone, and she wouldn't back down. They left the rusty spur, Jed watching them go, his face etched with worry. He knew that he couldn't stop them, that they were determined to face whatever awaited them in the canyon. They rode hard, their horses' hooves pounding against the dusty ground, the wind whipping through their hair. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a vast expanse of desert and rock, dotted with cacti and scrub brush. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows, making the terrain seem even more desolate and ominous. As they approached the North Canyon, the sound of gunfire grew louder, punctuated by shouts and screams. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Rosie felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She knew that they were riding into a battle, a fight for survival. Jack slowed his horse, his eyes scanning the terrain, his senses alert. He knew the canyon well, having tracked Blackwood through it many times before. He knew its hidden trails, its secret passages, its deadly traps. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice low and cautious. "Blackwood knows this canyon like the back of his hand. He could be anywhere." They dismounted, tying their horses to a scrubby bush, hidden from view. They moved on foot, Jack leading the way, his rifle at the ready, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Rosie followed close behind, her pistol clutched tightly in her hand, her senses on high alert. The canyon was a maze of narrow passages, towering rock formations, and hidden crevices. The echoes of the gunfire bounced off the canyon walls, making it difficult to pinpoint the source of the fighting. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by the occasional crackle of gunfire and the cries of the wounded. Suddenly, Jack stopped, his body tense, his hand raised in a warning gesture. He pointed towards a narrow crevice in the rock wall, his eyes narrowed. "There and there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Blackwood's men, ambushing the sheriff and his deputies." Rosie peered through the crevice, her heart sinking at the sight that greeted her. Sheriff Thompson and his deputies were pinned down, trapped in a narrow passage, under heavy fire from Blackwood's men, who were hidden among the rocks above. The sheriff and his deputies were outnumbered and outgunned, their situation desperate. Rosie felt a surge of anger and determination. She couldn't stand by and watch them be slaughtered. She had to do something. "We have to help them," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting Jack's. Jack nodded, his face grim. He knew that they were walking into a trap, that the odds were stacked against them. But he also knew that they couldn't abandon the sheriff and his deputies to their fate. "I'll draw their fire," he said, his voice low and resolute. "You cover me." He took a deep breath, his eyes hardening with determination. He knew that this could be his last stand, his final confrontation with Blackwood. But he was ready. He was Jack Mercer, and he wouldn't back down. The unforgiving land was about to become a battleground, and Rosie, armed with her pistol and a fierce determination, was ready to stand by his side. Chapter 8. Scars of a Heart. Jack, with a nod to Rosie, moved swiftly and silently, positioning himself at the edge of the crevice, his rifle aimed at the rocks where Blackwood's men were hidden. He knew he was outnumbered, but he had the element of surprise on his side. He had to make every shot count. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of his rifle echoed through the canyon, followed by a yelp of pain. One of Blackwood's men fell from his perch, his body tumbling down the rocks. The other outlaws, startled by the sudden attack, returned fire, their bullets whizzing past Jack's head, chipping away at the rock face around him. He ducked back behind the cover of the crevice, his heart pounding, his senses on high alert. Rosie, positioned a few feet away, fired her pistol at the outlaws, her shots providing cover for Jack. She wasn't as skilled a marksman as he was, but she was determined to do her part, to protect him and help the sheriff and his deputies. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the sounds echoing off the rock walls, creating a deafening roar. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the acrid stench of fear. Jack moved quickly, firing his rifle with deadly accuracy, taking down another outlaw. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of motion and violence, his movements honed by years of experience. He was fighting not just for his own survival, but for Rosie, for the sheriff, for the chance at redemption. Rosie, despite her fear, held her ground, firing her pistol whenever she had a clear shot. She saw one of Blackwood's men aiming at Jack, his finger tightening on the trigger. Without hesitation, she raised her pistol and fired, her bullet striking the outlaw in the arm, causing him to drop his rifle and cry out in pain. Jack glanced at her, a fleeting expression of gratitude in his eyes. He knew she had saved his life, that her courage and quick thinking had made the difference. The battle raged on, a brutal, close-quarters fight for survival. Jack and Rosie, working together, managed to gain a slight advantage, forcing Blackwood's men to retreat further into the canyon. Sheriff Thompson, seeing an opportunity, rallied his deputies and charged forward, engaging the outlaws in a fierce hand-to-hand combat. The canyon became a scene of chaos, a melee of struggling bodies, grunts, and cries of pain. Jack, seeing that the sheriff and his deputies had the situation under control, turned his attention to finding Blackwood. He knew that the outlaw leader wouldn't be far away, that he would be lurking in the shadows, waiting for a chance to strike. He moved deeper into the canyon, his rifle at the ready, his senses on high alert. He knew that Blackwood was a ruthless and cunning opponent, a man who wouldn't hesitate to kill. Suddenly, he heard a voice, a familiar, chilling voice that sent a shiver down his spine. Well, the voice drawled. If it ain't the ranger. Come to die, have you? Jack turned towards the voice, his eyes narrowing. He saw Blackwood standing on a ledge above him, a sneer on his face, a rifle in his hands. He was a tall, imposing man, with a scarred face and cold, cruel eyes. It's over, Blackwood, Jack said, his voice calm and steady, his rifle aimed at the outlaw leader. Surrender. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, mocking sound.
Surrender? He scoffed.
You think I'd surrender to the likes of you? You're a dead man, Ranger. Just like your men. His words were a deliberate taunt, a reminder of Jack's past failure, the deaths of his men that haunted him still. But Jack didn't flinch, didn't let the pain of the past distract him. It wasn't my fault, Blackwood, he said, his voice firm. You ambushed us. You're the one responsible for their deaths. Blackwood's sneer widened. You were weak, Ranger, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. You were careless. And you paid the price. He raised his rifle, aiming it at Jack. Now you're going to pay the ultimate price. Before Blackwood could pull the trigger, a shot rang out, striking him in the shoulder. He cried out in pain, dropping his rifle, his body staggering back. Rosie stood at the entrance of a canyon. The pistol was still in her grip. Jack looked at Rosie, then back at Blackwood, who was clutching his wounded shoulder, his face contorted with rage and pain. The scars of the heart, Jack realized, were not just his own. They were etched on Rosie's face, in the lines of worry and determination, in the unwavering gaze that met his. They were shared scars, forged in the crucible of the unforgiving land, a bond that transcended the violence and chaos around them. He knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Chapter 9. A Dance with Danger. Blackwood, wounded and enraged, scrambled back, disappearing into the labyrinthine depths of the canyon. Jack, his adrenaline still pumping, wanted to pursue him, to finish the fight once and for all. But he knew that Rosie needed him, that she had risked her life to save him, and he couldn't leave her alone. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Rosie nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I'm fine," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But we need to get out of here. Blackwood will be back with more men." Jack knew she was right. They were exposed, vulnerable, and outnumbered. They needed to regroup, to find a safe place to plan their next move. He helped her up, his hand lingering on hers for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of their shared experience, their unspoken bond. They retrieved their horses and rode back towards redemption, the echoes of the gunfight still ringing in their ears. As they rode, Jack couldn't shake the image of Blackwood's face, his eyes filled with hatred and the promise of revenge. He knew that this wasn't over, that Blackwood would come after them, that their lives were in danger. They reached the rusty spur, the familiar sight of the saloon a welcome relief after the chaos of the canyon. Jed rushed out to meet them, his face etched with worry. "Are you both all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "We heard the shooting." "We're fine, Jed," Rosie said, her voice reassuring. "But Blackwood's still out there. And he's coming for us." Jed's face turned grim. "We need to be ready for him," he said, his voice determined. "We'll protect the saloon, and we'll protect you both." They went inside, the saloon feeling like a sanctuary, a safe haven in the midst of the storm. Rosie went behind the bar, her movements automatic, her mind racing with plans. She needed to fortify the saloon, to prepare for Blackwood's inevitable attack. Jack, meanwhile, was pacing restlessly, his mind consumed with thoughts of Blackwood. He knew he couldn't stay in redemption, that he was putting Rosie and Jed in danger. He needed to leave, to draw Blackwood away from the town, to protect them from his wrath. But he also knew that he couldn't leave Rosie. He'd grown to care for her, to admire her courage and resilience. He felt a connection to her, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of danger and shared experience. He was torn between his desire to protect her and his need to confront Blackwood, to end the cycle of violence once and for all. As the evening wore on, the tension in the saloon grew thicker, the air heavy with anticipation. Rosie and Jed worked tirelessly, barricading the doors and windows, preparing for the inevitable attack. Jack cleaned his rifle, his movements precise and methodical, his mind focused on the task at hand. Rosie watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and affection. She knew that he was wrestling with a difficult decision, that he was torn between his duty and his feelings for her. She wanted to tell him to stay, to beg him not to leave her. But she also knew that she couldn't ask him to abandon his mission, to turn his back on his past. As night fell, a sense of foreboding settled over the town. The streets were deserted, the houses dark and silent. The only sound was the wind whistling through the empty streets, a mournful cry that echoed the tension and fear that gripped the inhabitants of Redemption. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the door of the saloon, a shadowy silhouette against the dim light of the street. It was Sheriff Thompson, his face grim, his clothes stained with blood. "Blackwood's men are coming," he said, his voice urgent. "They're heading this way. You need to get out of here." Jack stepped forward, his rifle at the ready. "I'm not going anywhere, Sheriff," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to stand and fight." Rosie joined him, her hand resting on his arm. "We're with you, Jack," she said, her voice unwavering. "We're not going to abandon you." Thompson looked at them, his expression a mixture of admiration and resignation. He knew that he couldn't force them to leave, that their loyalty to each other was too strong. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with acceptance. "But be careful. Blackwood is a ruthless killer. He won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in his way." He turned to leave, his figure disappearing into the darkness. Jack, Rosie, and Jed were left alone, facing the inevitable confrontation. They were a small, unlikely band of defenders, standing against a much larger force. But they were united by their loyalty, their courage, and their determination to protect each other and their home. It was a dance with danger, a waltz with fate, and the music was just beginning. The floor was set, and so were their wills. Chapter 10. The Weight of Secrets. The silence that followed Sheriff Thompson's departure was heavy, pregnant with the unspoken threat that hung in the air. The Rusty Spur, usually a place of boisterous laughter and clinking glasses, felt like a fortress under siege, its thick wooden walls the only barrier between them and the impending storm. Rosie moved behind the bar, her hands instinctively reaching for the familiar comfort of the smooth, worn wood. She checked the loads on the shotguns she kept hidden beneath the counter, her movements precise and economical, a testament to her years of experience in this rough and tumble world. Jack stood near the window, his gaze fixed on the darkened street, his senses on high alert. He was a coiled spring, ready to unleash his fury on anyone who dared to threaten Rosie or the saloon. He knew Blackwood's tactics, his ruthlessness, his penchant for violence. He had to be prepared for anything. Jed, ever vigilant, stood guard at the door, his massive frame a reassuring presence in the dimly lit room. He held a heavy axe in his hands, his grip tight, his eyes constantly scanning the street for any sign of movement. "He'll probably try to set fire to the place," Jack said, his voice low and thoughtful, breaking the silence. "He likes to use fire. It's his way of sending a message." Rosie nodded, her face grim. "We'll be ready for him," she said, her voice firm. "We have plenty of water buckets, and the well is full." They had prepared as best they could, but they knew that Blackwood was cunning and resourceful. He had men and resources, and he wouldn't hesitate to use them. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the saloon grew almost unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, sounded like an approaching enemy. Rosie felt a knot of fear tightening in her stomach, but she pushed it down, determined to remain strong and resolute. Suddenly, a shout erupted from the street, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The attack had begun. Jack moved swiftly, positioning himself near the shattered window, his rifle aimed at the darkness. Rosie joined him, a shotgun in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. Figures emerged from the shadows, shadowy silhouettes against the flickering light of the lanterns that lined the street. They were Blackwood's men, armed with rifles, pistols, and torches. They were a motley crew of outlaws, their faces hardened by years of violence and lawlessness. "Stay back," Jack shouted, his voice booming through the saloon. "This is your last warning." His words were met with a volley of gunfire, bullets whizzing through the air, shattering the remaining windows and splintering the wooden walls. The saloon erupted in chaos, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire, shouts, and the screams of the wounded. Jack returned fire, his rifle shots precise and deadly. He moved with a practiced ease, dodging bullets, taking cover, and reloading with lightning speed. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of motion and violence, his skills honed by years of experience. Rosie, standing beside him, fired her shotgun, the blast echoing through the saloon. She wasn't as skilled a marksman as Jack, but she was determined to defend her home, her livelihood, and the man she had come to care for. Jed, standing guard at the door, swung his axe with deadly force, repelling anyone who dared to approach. He was a mountain of a man, his strength and loyalty unwavering. The battle raged on, a brutal, close-quarters fight for survival. The saloon was filled with smoke, the smell of gunpowder and blood. The air was thick with tension, the outcome hanging in the balance. Suddenly, Rosie saw a figure moving towards the back of the saloon, carrying a torch. It was one of Blackwood's men, intent on setting fire to the building.
"Jack!"
She shouted, her voice urgent. The back. Jack turned, his eyes widening in alarm. He saw the figure with the torch, and he knew that if the saloon caught fire, they would be trapped, unable to escape. He raised his rifle and fired, but his shot went wide, the outlaw dodging the bullet and continuing towards the back of the saloon. Rosie, seeing that Jack was unable to stop him, reacted instinctively. She dropped her shotgun and ran towards the back of the saloon, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to stop him, no matter the cost. She reached the back door just as the outlaw was about to throw the torch inside. She tackled him, knocking him to the ground, the torch falling from his hand and rolling away. They struggled on the floor, the outlaw trying to overpower her, his hands reaching for her throat. Rosie fought back with all her strength, her nails digging into his flesh, her knees striking his groin. She managed to break free, scrambling to her feet, her eyes searching for a weapon. She saw a heavy iron skillet hanging on the wall, and she grabbed it, swinging it with all her might. The skillet connected with the outlaw's head, a sickening thud echoing through the saloon. He slumped to the ground, unconscious, his body still. Rosie stood there, breathing heavily, her body trembling with adrenaline. She had saved the saloon, but the fight was far from over. The weight of secrets, both her own and Jack's, pressed down on her. She knew that this night was not just about survival, it was about confronting the past and deciding what kind of future they wanted, if they were to have one at all. Chapter 11. Under a Blood Moon. As Rosie stood over the unconscious outlaw, a chilling realization washed over her. The attack had been too easy, too straightforward. Blackwood was known for his cunning, his elaborate schemes, his penchant for psychological warfare. This frontal assault fell off. Where was Blackwood? The question was answered almost immediately. A harsh, mocking laugh echoed from the front of the saloon, followed by a voice that sent a shiver down Rosie's spine. Well, the voice drawled. The Widow Boone proves to be more resourceful than I anticipated. Blackwood stepped into the saloon, his tall frame silhouetted against the flickering light of the burning torches outside. He was surrounded by his men, their rifles trained on Jack and Jed, who were now cornered near the bar, their ammunition running low. Blackwood's eyes, cold and cruel, fixed on Rosie. He smiled, a chilling, predatory smile that revealed his utter lack of empathy. "You should have stayed out of this, Rosie," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This is between me and the ranger." Jack, his face grim, his rifle now empty, stood defiantly, his gaze locked on Blackwood. "It's over, Blackwood," he said, his voice firm. "You're not going to win." Blackwood laughed again, a harsh, grating sound. "You think so?" he scoffed. "I have you outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. You're finished, Ranger. Just like your men." He gestured to his men, who tightened their grip on their rifles, their fingers hovering over the triggers. The situation was desperate, the air thick with tension, the outcome seemingly inevitable. Rosie, her mind racing, knew that she had to do something, anything, to save Jack and Jed. She couldn't let Blackwood win, couldn't let him destroy everything she held dear. She looked around the saloon, her eyes searching for an advantage, a weapon, anything that could help them turn the tide. Her gaze fell on the lanterns hanging from the ceiling, their flames flickering precariously. An idea sparked in her mind, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had.
"Jack!"
she shouted, her voice urgent. "The lanterns." Jack, understanding her plan instantly, nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He knew it was a risky move, but it was their only hope. As Blackwood's men prepared to fire, Rosie grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the bar, smashed it against the counter, and hurled the contents at the nearest lantern. The whiskey ignited instantly, creating a wall of flames that separated them from Blackwood's men. The outlaws, startled by the sudden burst of fire, hesitated, their aim disrupted. Jack seized the opportunity, charging forward, tackling one of the outlaws and wresting his rifle away from him. Jed, taking advantage of the distraction, swung his axe, striking another outlaw and sending him sprawling to the floor. The saloon erupted in chaos once more, a melee of struggling bodies, shouts, and the roar of the flames. Rosie, using the confusion to her advantage, grabbed another bottle of whiskey and threw it at another lantern, creating another wall of fire. The saloon was becoming an inferno, the heat intense, the smoke choking. Blackwood, enraged by Rosie's defiance, roared at his men to shoot her, but they were unable to get a clear shot, the flames and smoke obscuring their vision. Jack, now armed with a rifle, fired at Blackwood's men, his shots precise and deadly. He was fighting with a renewed fury, fueled by his desire to protect Rosie and to avenge the deaths of his men. The battle raged on, a desperate struggle for survival. The saloon was a scene of chaos and destruction, the flames consuming everything in their path. Suddenly, the moon, which had been hidden behind clouds, emerged, casting an eerie, blood-red glow over the scene. It was a full moon, a blood moon, a symbol of impending doom. Blackwood, seeing the moon, seemed to draw strength from it, his eyes gleaming with a renewed intensity. "It's a sign," he shouted, his voice crazed. "The ranger's time is up." He raised his own rifle, aiming it at Jack, his finger tightening on the trigger. Rosie, seeing the danger, screamed, "Jack, look out." But it was too late. Blackwood fired, the bullet whizzing through the air, heading straight for Jack. Time seemed to slow down. And then, with the crimson light casting long shadows, something wholly unexpected transpired. A figure leapt in front, shielding. Not Rosie. Not Jed. Sheriff Thompson stood, blood blooming on his chest, having taken the bullet meant for Jack. Chapter 12. The Promise of Tomorrow. Sheriff Thompson's body crumpled to the floor, the impact of the bullet sending a shockwave through the room. The sudden, unexpected sacrifice silenced the chaos, the roar of the flames momentarily drowned out by the collective gasp of disbelief. Jack, stunned and horrified, rushed to Thompson's side, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt beside the fallen sheriff, his hands hovering over the wound, his mind racing. "Sheriff," he shouted, his voice filled with anguish.
"Hold on."
Thompson, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow, looked up at Jack, a faint smile on his lips. "Got him for you," he whispered, his voice weak, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of pain and peace. Rosie, her face streaked with tears and soot, joined Jack, her hand reaching out to touch Thompson's arm. "Sheriff," she said, her voice choked with emotion.
"Why?"
Thompson coughed, a spasm of pain racking his body. "Had to do right thing," he whispered, his gaze shifting between Jack and Rosie. "You both deserve chance." His eyes closed, his breathing stopped, his body going limp. Sheriff Thompson, the lawman of redemption, was dead, a victim of his own sense of justice, his own unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Jack, his heart heavy with grief and guilt, closed Thompson's eyes, his hand trembling. He had lost another friend, another comrade, another casualty in his long and bloody war against Blackwood. Blackwood, seeing his opportunity, seized the moment. "He's dead," he shouted, his voice triumphant. "Now it's your turn, Ranger." He raised his rifle, aiming it at Jack, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a shot rang out, striking him in the leg. He screamed in pain, dropping his rifle, his body collapsing to the floor. Jed stood near the entrance of the saloon, smoke curling from the barrel of his rifle. He had taken advantage of the chaos and confusion to get a clear shot at Blackwood. Blackwood's men, seeing their leader fall, hesitated, their resolve wavering. They were trapped in a burning building, surrounded by flames and smoke, their situation desperate. Jack, seeing their hesitation, seized the opportunity. "Drop your weapons," he shouted, his voice commanding. "It's over." The outlaws, realizing they were defeated, reluctantly obeyed, dropping their rifles and pistols to the floor. They were a beaten, demoralized group, their spirit broken by the death of the sheriff and the wounding of their leader. Jack, his rifle still trained on Blackwood, approached the wounded outlaw, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disgust. "It's over, Blackwood," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You're finished." Blackwood, his face contorted with pain and rage, glared at Jack, his eyes filled with hatred. "You may have won this battle, Ranger," he snarled, "but you haven't won the war. I'll be back. I'll get you for this." Jack ignored his threats, his focus on securing the prisoners and ensuring the safety of Rosie and Jed. He ordered the outlaws to be tied up, and he helped Jed extinguish the remaining flames in the saloon. The Rusty Spur, once a vibrant and bustling establishment, was now a smoldering ruin, its interior charred and blackened, its walls riddled with bullet holes. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burnt wood, a testament to the violence that had transpired. Rosie, her face streaked with soot and tears, surveyed the damage, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and relief. She had lost her saloon, her livelihood, but she had survived. And more importantly, Jack was alive. She walked over to him, her eyes meeting his. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft, her gaze searching his. Jack nodded, his face weary, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "It's over," he said, his voice confirming her hopes. For now, at least. He knew that Blackwood's threat was not an idle one, that he would likely seek revenge. But for now, they had won. They had survived. And they had each other. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, wiping away a smudge of soot. "Thank you, Rosie," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She had faced her fears, risked her life, and emerged victorious. She had found a strength within herself that she never knew existed. And she had found something else, something she had thought she'd lost forever: love. She looked at Jack, her eyes filled with affection, her heart overflowing with a newfound hope. The promise of tomorrow, she realized, wasn't just about rebuilding the saloon or facing future threats. It was about the possibility of a new beginning, a chance to build a life together, a life free from the shadows of the past. The blood moon had set, and a new dawn, however uncertain, was on the horizon. Chapter 13. A Reckoning at Dawn. The first rays of dawn painted the sky with hues of pale pink and orange, casting a soft, ethereal glow over the ravaged town of Redemption. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke and the lingering scent of gunpowder, a stark reminder of the night's violent events. Jack and Rosie stood outside the charred remains of the Rusty Spur, surveying the damage, their faces grim, their hearts heavy. The saloon, once a symbol of their shared dreams and Rosie's livelihood, was now a smoldering ruin, a testament to Blackwood's ruthlessness and the destructive power of hatred. Jed emerged from the makeshift jail, his face weary, his clothes stained with soot and blood. He had spent the night guarding Blackwood and his men, ensuring they didn't escape. "They're secure," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But Blackwood's wound is bad. He needs a doctor." Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the jail. He knew that Blackwood was a dangerous man, even wounded and imprisoned. He couldn't afford to underestimate him, not even now. "I'll fetch Doc Miller," Rosie said, her voice determined. "He's the only one in town who can tend to Blackwood's wound." She started to walk away, but Jack stopped her, his hand gently grasping her arm. "Be careful, Rosie," he said, his voice filled with concern. Blackwood's men might still be lurking around. She smiled, a faint, reassuring smile. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice steady. "I can handle myself." She walked away, her figure disappearing into the early morning mist, her steps purposeful and resolute. Jack watched her go, his heart filled with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. He turned to Jed. "Stay here and guard the prisoners," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to scout the town, make sure it's safe." Jed nodded, his hand resting on the handle of his axe. "Don't worry, Jack," he said, his voice confident. "I won't let them escape." Jack rode through the deserted streets of Redemption, his eyes scanning the buildings, the alleyways, the shadows. The town was eerily silent, the only sound the creak of a saddle and the occasional caw of a crow. He saw signs of the previous night's violence everywhere: shattered windows, bullet holes in the walls, bloodstains on the dusty ground. The town, like the saloon, bore the scars of Blackwood's attack. As he rode past the sheriff's office, he saw a figure standing outside, a woman dressed in black, her face veiled, her body trembling with grief. It was Sheriff Thompson's widow, mourning the loss of her husband. Jack dismounted, his heart heavy with sorrow. He approached the widow, his hat in his hand, his head bowed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft and respectful, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your husband was a good man, a brave man. He died a hero." The widow looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "He always did what was right," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Even when it cost him his life." Jack nodded, his own eyes stinging with tears. He knew the truth of her words. Thompson had sacrificed himself to save Jack, to uphold the law, to protect the innocent. "He won't be forgotten," Jack said, his voice firm. "I promise you that." He remounted his horse and continued his patrol, his heart filled with a renewed determination to bring Blackwood to justice, to honor Thompson's sacrifice, to make Redemption a safe and peaceful town once more. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape, Rosie returned to the jail, Doc Miller in tow. The doctor, a small, wiry man with a weathered face and kind eyes, examined Blackwood's wound, his movements precise and efficient. "He'll live," Doc Miller said, his voice matter-of-fact. "But he'll have a limp for the rest of his life." Blackwood, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with hatred, glared at Jack. "This isn't over, Ranger," he snarled. "I'll get you for this. I swear it." Jack ignored his threats, his focus on ensuring that Blackwood was securely imprisoned and that the town was safe. He knew that Blackwood would be tried and punished for his crimes, that justice would be served. As the day wore on, the town of Redemption slowly began to come back to life. People emerged from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and relief. They had survived the night, but the scars of the battle would remain, a constant reminder of the violence that had shattered their peace. It was time for the reckoning. It was time for the townsfolk to know. A crowd gathered. Jack, standing tall with Rosie by his side. He announced. Sheriff Thompson was dead. Blackwood was captured. It was the reckoning at dawn, the moment where the town had to decide its future, its fate, and the weight of justice. Chapter 14. The Ties That Bind. The news of Sheriff Thompson's death and Blackwood's capture spread through Redemption like wildfire, drawing the townsfolk out of their homes and into the dusty main street. A somber crowd gathered outside the jail, their faces a mixture of grief, relief, and apprehension. The weight of the previous night's events hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that crackled like static electricity. Jack, standing on the steps of the jail, his face grim but resolute, addressed the crowd. He recounted the events of the night, his voice clear and steady, his words carefully chosen to convey the gravity of the situation without inciting panic. He spoke of Thompson's bravery, his ultimate sacrifice, and his unwavering commitment to justice. Sheriff Thompson gave his life to protect this town, Jack said, his voice ringing with emotion. He died a hero, and we owe him a debt of gratitude that we can never repay. A hush fell over the crowd, a collective moment of silence in honor of the fallen sheriff. Tears streamed down the faces of many, their grief a raw and visible wound. Jack continued, his voice firm and unwavering. But Thompson's sacrifice was not in vain, he said. Blackwood and his men are captured, and they will be brought to justice. They will pay for their crimes. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, a sense of relief and a thirst for justice palpable in their expressions. They had endured Blackwood's reign of terror for too long, and they were ready to see him punished. Rosie, standing beside Jack, her hand resting on his arm, felt a surge of pride and admiration for the man he was. He had faced danger with courage, he had protected the innocent, and he had brought a semblance of peace back to redemption. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes meeting the gazes of her neighbors, her friends, the people she had lived alongside for years. She saw their fear, their grief, but she also saw their resilience, their determination to rebuild their lives, their community. "We've been through a lot," Rosie said, her voice clear and strong, addressing the crowd. "We've lost our sheriff, and we've lost our homes, our businesses. But we haven't lost our spirit. We haven't lost our hope." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces before her. "We will rebuild," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "We will rebuild our town, our lives, and we will honor Sheriff Thompson's memory by creating a community where justice and peace prevail." Her words resonated with the crowd, a spark of hope igniting in their hearts. They had been through hell, but they were survivors. They were the people of redemption, and they would not be defeated. As the crowd dispersed, a sense of unity, of shared purpose, began to emerge. People started to help each other, clearing debris, offering food and shelter, comforting those who had lost loved ones. The ties that bound them together, the bonds of community and friendship, were stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of shared adversity. Jack and Rosie, watching the town come back to life, felt a sense of profound satisfaction. They had played a part in bringing about this change, in inspiring this renewed sense of hope and resilience. But they also knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Blackwood was still alive, still a threat, and his influence might reach beyond the walls of the jail. They needed to remain vigilant, to protect themselves and the town from any further danger. As the day drew to a close, Jack and Rosie found themselves standing once again in front of the charred remains of the rusty spur. The setting sun cast long shadows over the ruined building, a poignant reminder of what they had lost. "What will you do now, Rosie?" Jack asked, his voice soft, his gaze searching hers. Rosie looked at the ruins of her saloon, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "I don't know," she said, her voice honest. "I haven't thought that far ahead." She had spent years building the rusty spur, pouring her heart and soul into making it a success. It was more than just a business, it was her home, her legacy, a symbol of her independence and resilience. But now it was gone, and she was faced with the daunting task of starting over, of rebuilding her life from scratch. Jack reached out, his hand gently covering hers. "You don't have to do it alone, Rosie," he said, his voice filled with tenderness. "I'm here for you. We'll rebuild together." His words warmed her heart, a balm to her wounded spirit. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and affection. She had found a partner, a friend, a lover, in the midst of chaos and violence. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "That means everything to me." They stood there for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their gazes locked, their hearts connected. The ties that bound them, forged in the fires of adversity, were stronger than ever. They had faced danger together, they had survived, and they had found love in the most unexpected of places. The future was uncertain, but they were ready to face it together, to rebuild their lives, their community, and to create a new beginning, a new chapter in their shared story. The setting sun, a fiery ball of orange and red, dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. It was a promise of a new day, a new dawn, a new hope. Chapter 15. Beneath a Starlit Sky. The days following Blackwood's capture were a blur of activity. The townsfolk of Redemption, spurred by a renewed sense of community and Rosie's unwavering optimism, worked tirelessly to clear the debris, repair the damage, and begin the long process of rebuilding their lives. The spirit of cooperation was palpable, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Jack, despite his own uncertain future, remained in Redemption, working alongside Rosie and Jed, helping to clear the rubble of the rusty spur and offering his assistance wherever it was needed. He felt a sense of belonging, a connection to this town and its people that he had never experienced before. He had found a home, a place where he was accepted, respected, and even loved. Rosie, though grieving the loss of her saloon, found solace in the outpouring of support from her neighbors and friends. Offers of help poured in, from offers of temporary lodging to donations of food, clothing, and building materials. She was overwhelmed by their generosity, their kindness, their unwavering belief in her ability to rebuild. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the recovering town, Jack and Rosie found themselves sitting on the porch of a temporary cabin that had been provided for Rosie by a neighboring rancher. They were exhausted, their bodies aching from days of hard labor, but their spirits were high. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Rosie said, her voice filled with wonder, gazing out at the starlit sky. "How everyone has come together to help." Jack nodded, his arm around her shoulders, his gaze following hers. "It is," he said, his voice soft. "It shows the true spirit of this town, the strength of its people." They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. The night sky was a breathtaking spectacle, a vast expanse of darkness studded with millions of twinkling stars. "I've been thinking," Rosie said, her voice thoughtful, breaking the silence. "About the future. About what I want to do." Jack turned to her, his eyes filled with curiosity. "And?" he prompted. "I don't want to rebuild the saloon," she said, her voice firm, her gaze meeting his. "Not the way it was, at least." Jack was surprised, but he understood. The rusty spur, for all its significance, had been a symbol of a past life, a life filled with hardship and loss. It was time for something new, something different. "What do you want to do?" he asked, his voice gentle, his hand squeezing hers. Rosie smiled, her eyes sparkling with a newfound excitement. "I want to build a place where people can come together," she said, her voice filled with passion. "A place for families, for children, for everyone. A place where we can celebrate life, not just drown our sorrows." She envisioned a community hall, a gathering place where people could share meals, hold dances, celebrate holidays, and build lasting memories. A place that would foster a sense of belonging, a sense of unity, a sense of hope. Jack's heart swelled with pride and admiration for the woman beside him. She had faced adversity with courage, she had overcome loss with grace, and she had emerged with a vision for a better future, not just for herself, but for the entire town. "That's a wonderful idea, Rosie," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I'll help you build it. Every step of the way." His words were a promise, a commitment to a shared future, a future filled with hope, love, and the promise of a new beginning. They sat there for a long time, beneath the starlit sky, talking about their dreams, their plans, their hopes for the future. They spoke of building a home together, a place where they could create a life filled with love, laughter, and companionship. As the night deepened, the stars seemed to shine even brighter, illuminating their faces, their smiles, their shared joy. They were two souls, once lost and alone, who had found each other in the midst of chaos and violence. They had found love, hope, and a reason to keep moving forward, to build a better future together. The vast, starlit sky above them seemed to stretch on forever, a symbol of the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. They were ready to embrace those possibilities, to face whatever challenges came their way, to create a life that was filled with meaning, purpose, and enduring love. The night, with its quiet beauty and whispered promises, held them in its embrace, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the transformative power of love. Chapter 16. The Serpent's Coil. Weeks turned into months, and the town of redemption, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, began to take shape anew. The community hall, Rosie's dream, was slowly becoming a reality, its sturdy wooden frame rising from the ground, a symbol of hope and resilience. Jack and Rosie worked side by side, their love for each other deepening with each passing day, their shared purpose strengthening their bond. But the shadow of Blackwood still lingered, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beneath the surface. He was imprisoned in a newly rebuilt jail, awaiting trial, but his influence, like a serpent's coil, still reached beyond the prison walls. One morning, as Jack was working on the roof of the community hall, he saw a rider approaching, a stranger with a hard face and shifty eyes. The man dismounted, his hand hovering near his gun, his gaze scanning the town with suspicion. Jack climbed down from the roof, his senses on high alert. He approached the stranger, his hand resting on the butt of his own gun. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, his voice calm but firm. The stranger looked at him, his eyes narrowed. "I'm looking for Blackwood," he said, his voice gruff. Jack's suspicions were confirmed. This was one of Blackwood's men, come to cause trouble. "Blackwood's in jail," Jack said, his voice cold. "Where he belongs." The stranger scoffed. "He won't be there for long," he said, his voice dripping with confidence. "We have ways of getting him out." Jack knew that Blackwood had allies, powerful connections that could influence the legal system, even bribe officials. He had to be prepared for anything. "You're wasting your time," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "Blackwood will face justice.
He won't escape."
The stranger smiled, a chilling, predatory smile. "We'll see about that, Ranger," he said. "We'll see." He turned and mounted his horse, riding away, his figure disappearing into the distance. Jack watched him go, his mind racing. He knew that this was just the beginning, that Blackwood's men would be back, and they would be more determined than ever to free their leader. He went to Rosie, who was working inside the community hall, her hands covered in sawdust, her face beaming with pride as she surveyed the progress. "We have a problem," Jack said, his voice serious, recounting his encounter with the stranger. Rosie's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice filled with apprehension. Jack knew that they couldn't rely on the law alone to protect them. Blackwood's influence was too strong, his reach too long. They had to be proactive, to take matters into their own hands. "We need to be prepared," Jack said, his voice determined. "We need to strengthen the jail, increase security, and be ready for anything." They spent the rest of the day working to fortify the jail, reinforcing the doors and windows, adding extra bars, and making it as secure as possible. They also organized a town watch, a group of volunteers who would patrol the streets at night, keeping an eye out for any suspicious activity. But despite their efforts, a sense of unease settled over the town. The serpent's coil, Blackwood's lingering influence, was tightening, threatening to strangle the fragile peace they had worked so hard to achieve. One evening, as Jack and Rosie were walking home, they were ambushed by a group of Blackwood's men who emerged from the shadows, their guns drawn. "This is for Blackwood," one of the men shouted, his voice filled with hatred. Jack pushed Rosie behind him, drawing his own gun, returning fire. A gunfight erupted, the sounds of gunfire echoing through the quiet streets of Redemption. Jack and Rosie fought back to back, their movements coordinated, their skills honed by years of experience. They managed to take down several of the attackers, but they were outnumbered, and their ammunition was running low. Suddenly, a shot rang out, striking Jack in the shoulder. He cried out in pain, stumbling back, his gun falling from his hand. Rosie, seeing Jack wounded, screamed, her heart filled with terror. She grabbed his fallen gun and fired at the remaining attackers, her shots desperate but accurate. She managed to drive them back, forcing them to retreat into the shadows. She rushed to Jack's side, her hands trembling as she examined his wound.
"Jack,"
she cried, her voice choked with emotion. "Are you all right?" Jack, his face pale and drawn, his shoulder bleeding profusely, nodded weakly. "I'll be fine," he said, his voice strained. "It's just a flesh wound." But Rosie knew that it was more serious than he was letting on. He needed medical attention, and he needed it fast. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they stumbled towards Doc Miller's office. The serpent's coil had struck, and the venom of fear and uncertainty was spreading through Redemption once more. The fragile peace was shattered, and the future was once again uncertain. Chapter 17. A Trail of Tears. Rosie helped Jack into Doc Miller's office, her heart pounding with fear and anxiety. The doctor, roused from his sleep, quickly examined Jack's wound, his face grim. "The bullet went clean through," Doc Miller said, his voice relieved. "But he's lost a lot of blood. He needs rest and care." Rosie stayed by Jack's side throughout the night, tending to his wound, changing his bandages, and holding his hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. She was exhausted, her body aching, her mind racing with worry, but she refused to leave him. As dawn approached, Jack finally opened his eyes, his gaze focusing on Rosie. He smiled weakly, his hand squeezing hers. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse. Rosie smiled back, tears streaming down her face. "You would have done the same for me," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. He knew that he was lucky to be alive, that Rosie's courage and quick thinking had saved him from certain death. Over the next few days, Rosie nursed Jack back to health, her love and care a powerful balm to his wounded body and spirit. He regained his strength slowly, but surely, his determination to recover fueled by his love for Rosie and his desire to protect her and the town of Redemption. But the attack had left its mark, not just on Jack's body, but on the town's fragile peace. Fear and uncertainty spread like a disease, infecting the community, threatening to undo all the progress they had made. Blackwood, still imprisoned in the jail, seemed to gloat over the attack, his influence reaching beyond the prison walls, his presence a constant reminder of the danger that lurked. The town council, pressured by some of the more fearful residents, began to question Jack's presence in Redemption, suggesting that he was the reason for the violence, that he was attracting trouble. Rosie, fiercely protective of Jack, defended him vehemently, arguing that he was the only thing standing between them and Blackwood's complete control. She reminded them of his bravery, his sacrifice, his unwavering commitment to justice. But the seeds of doubt had been sown, and the council, divided and uncertain, decided to hold a town meeting to discuss Jack's future in Redemption. The meeting was held in the partially completed community hall, the atmosphere tense and charged. The townsfolk were divided, some supporting Jack, others fearing his presence, their voices rising in anger and accusation. Rosie, standing beside Jack, her hand resting on his arm, addressed the crowd, her voice clear and strong. She spoke of Jack's character, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to justice. She reminded them of all he had done for Redemption, his sacrifices, his bravery, his willingness to risk his life to protect them. "Jack is not the problem," Rosie said, her voice ringing with conviction. "Blackwood is the problem, and Jack is the only one who can stop him." Her words resonated with some, but others remained unconvinced, their fear outweighing their reason. The debate raged on, the outcome uncertain. Suddenly, a commotion erupted outside the hall. A rider approached, his horse galloping at full speed, his face etched with panic. "Blackwood's escaped," the rider shouted, his voice filled with terror. "He's got men with him, and they're heading this way." The news sent a wave of fear through the crowd, their arguments forgotten, their faces pale with dread. Blackwood, free and armed, was a threat to everyone in Redemption. Jack, despite his weakened condition, stepped forward, his face grim, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to prepare," he said, his voice commanding. "We need to defend the town." His words, spoken with such authority, galvanized the townsfolk. They forgot their differences, their fears, their doubts. They were united in their determination to protect their homes, their families, their community. The trail of tears, the path of violence and fear that Blackwood had carved through their lives, had led them to this moment, a moment of reckoning, a moment of truth. They were the people of Redemption, and they would not be defeated. They would stand together, fight together, and, if necessary, die together. The escape, the ensuing chaos, and the looming threat of Blackwood's return cast a long shadow, but it also ignited a fire of resistance in the hearts of the people of Redemption. Chapter 18. The Heart's True North. The news of Blackwood's escape sent a shockwave through Redemption, transforming the simmering tension into a palpable fear. But fear, in the face of overwhelming odds, can be a powerful catalyst. It can cripple, or it can ignite a fire of resistance. In Redemption, it ignited the latter. Jack, despite his recent injury, took charge, his voice calm and commanding, his presence a reassuring beacon in the storm of panic. He rallied the townsfolk, organizing them into a defense force, assigning tasks, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Rosie, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination, stood by Jack's side, her unwavering support a source of strength for him and for the entire town. She knew that this was their final stand, their chance to rid themselves of Blackwood's tyranny once and for all. They worked feverishly, barricading the streets, fortifying buildings, and preparing for a siege. The partially completed community hall, once a symbol of hope and unity, became a makeshift fortress, its sturdy walls offering a semblance of protection. As night fell, an eerie silence descended over Redemption. The townsfolk, armed with whatever weapons they could find, rifles, pistols, shotguns, even pitchforks and axes, waited, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. The waiting was the hardest part, the anticipation of the attack, the uncertainty of the outcome. But they were united in their purpose, their determination to protect their homes, their families, their community. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the thunder of hooves and the war cries of Blackwood's men. The attack had begun. Blackwood, riding at the head of his gang, his face twisted with rage and hatred, led the charge, his men firing their guns indiscriminately, their bullets whizzing through the air, shattering windows and splintering wood. The townsfolk returned fire, their shots desperate but determined. The streets of Redemption erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, shouts and screams, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Jack, positioned at the entrance of the community hall, fired his rifle with deadly accuracy, taking down several of Blackwood's men. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of motion and violence, his skills honed by years of experience. Rosie, standing beside him, reloaded his rifle, her hands steady despite her fear. She was his anchor, his support, his reason for fighting. The battle raged on, a brutal, close-quarters fight for survival. The townsfolk, outnumbered but not outmatched, fought with a ferocity born of desperation and a deep-seated love for their community. Blackwood, seeing his men falling, his attack faltering, grew increasingly enraged. He spurred his horse forward, charging towards the community hall, his gun blazing. "I'll kill you, Ranger," he shouted, his voice filled with hatred. "I'll kill you all." Jack, seeing Blackwood approaching, raised his rifle, aiming at the outlaw leader. But before he could fire, a shot rang out, striking Blackwood in the chest. Blackwood's body jerked violently, his eyes widening in surprise and pain. He slumped in his saddle, his gun falling from his hand, his body sliding to the ground. The shot had come from the rooftop of the community hall. Rosie stood there, smoke curling from the barrel of a rifle, her face pale but resolute. She had saved Jack's life, again. Blackwood's men, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They turned and fled, disappearing into the night, their attack defeated, their reign of terror over. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors and the crackling of the remaining fires. The battle was over. Redemption had been saved. Jack rushed to Rosie, his heart filled with gratitude and love. He embraced her, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us all." Rosie held him close, her body trembling with relief. "We did it together, Jack," she said, her voice soft. "We did it together." As dawn broke, casting a warm, golden glow over the battered town, the people of Redemption emerged from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of grief, relief, and a newfound sense of pride. They had faced their fears, they had fought for their freedom, and they had emerged victorious. They had discovered their heart's true north, their unwavering commitment to community, to justice, and to each other. Blackwood was dead. The threat was over. The healing could begin. And the love between Jack and Rosie, forged in the crucible of violence and chaos, shone brighter than ever, a beacon of hope for the future. Chapter 19. The Gathering Storm. The death of Blackwood marked a turning point for redemption. The immediate threat was gone, but the scars of his reign of terror remained, etched deep into the fabric of the town and the hearts of its people. The rebuilding process, both physical and emotional, would be long and arduous, but the spirit of unity and resilience that had emerged during the final battle provided a solid foundation for the future. Jack and Rosie, now hailed as heroes, became the driving force behind the reconstruction efforts. The community hall, Rosie's dream, was finally completed, its grand opening a celebration of the town's triumph over adversity and a symbol of its renewed hope. But even in the midst of celebration, a sense of unease lingered. Blackwood's network of influence, though weakened, was not entirely eradicated. Rumors circulated of his remaining allies, scattered and disorganized, but still potentially dangerous. And then there was the matter of Jack's past. The charges against him in Texas, though seemingly forgotten in the chaos of recent events, still loomed over him, a legal sword of Damocles hanging by a thread. One day, a stranger arrived in Redemption Atoll, imposing man with a stern face and a badge pinned to his chest. He was a U.S. Marshal, sent to investigate Blackwood's death and, inevitably, to confront Jack about his past. The Marshal, whose name was Evans, questioned Jack extensively, his inquiries probing and relentless. He had gathered information about Jack's time as a Texas Ranger, about the ambush, the deaths of his men, and the subsequent charges of negligence and dereliction of duty. Jack, though wary, answered the Marshal's questions truthfully, his voice calm and steady, his gaze unwavering. He had nothing to hide, but he also knew that the truth, in this case, was a complex and painful tapestry of guilt, regret, and a desperate desire for redemption. Rosie, fiercely protective of Jack, stood by his side during the questioning, her presence a source of strength and support. She knew the truth of his heart, his inherent goodness, his unwavering commitment to justice. She would not let the past, however painful, define his future. The Marshal, though seemingly impartial, seemed to harbor a preconceived notion of Jack's guilt, his questions laced with suspicion and a subtle hint of accusation. He was a man of the law, bound by duty and procedure, but he also seemed to be influenced by the lingering whispers of Blackwood's network, by the subtle pressures of powerful interests who wanted to see Jack punished. As the investigation continued, the tension in Redemption grew. The townsfolk, though grateful to Jack for his role in defeating Blackwood, were also wary of the attention he was attracting, the potential for further conflict and instability. The gathering storm, the threat of legal repercussions, and the lingering influence of Blackwood's allies loomed over Redemption, casting a shadow over the fragile peace they had fought so hard to achieve. One evening, as Jack and Rosie were walking home, they were confronted by a group of men, shadowy figures who emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden, their intentions clear. "You're coming with us, Ranger," one of the men said, his voice menacing. "We have unfinished business." Jack, recognizing the threat, pushed Rosie behind him, his hand reaching for his gun. But before he could draw, a shot rang out, striking one of the men in the arm. The attackers, startled and disoriented, retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Standing at the edge of the darkness, a rifle in his hand, was Jed, his face grim, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. He had been watching over them, protecting them, his loyalty unwavering. The attempted abduction, a clear indication of the forces arrayed against Jack, served as a stark reminder of the danger they faced. The gathering storm was about to break, and the future of Redemption and Jack's freedom hung in the balance. It was a test, a storm, not of the elements, but of the remnants of an empire of evil, clinging to its final threads of power. Chapter 20. The Final Confrontation of Hearts and Horizons. The attempted abduction of Jack served as a stark warning, a clear indication that the forces aligned against him were growing bolder, more desperate. Marshall Evans, though seemingly committed to upholding the law, was also under increasing pressure from unseen influences, powerful interests who wanted to see Jack punished, regardless of the truth. The town of Redemption, once again on edge, found itself divided. Some rallied behind Jack and Rosie, their loyalty unwavering, their gratitude for their past heroism outweighing their fear of the future. Others, swayed by fear and uncertainty, began to question Jack's presence, whispering doubts and accusations, their anxieties fueled by the lingering threat of Blackwood's network. Jack, facing the prospect of arrest and extradition to Texas, knew that he had to act, to confront the forces arrayed against him, to clear his name once and for all. He could not allow the shadows of his past to dictate his future, to jeopardize the fragile peace he had helped to build in Redemption. He decided to take a proactive approach, to seek out the truth behind the charges against him, to uncover the evidence that would prove his innocence and expose the corruption that had led to the ambush and the deaths of his men. Rosie, though fearful for his safety, supported his decision wholeheartedly. She knew that he could not live under a cloud of suspicion, that he needed to confront his past, to reclaim his honor, to secure their future together. With Jed's unwavering support, Jack and Rosie began their own investigation, gathering information, interviewing witnesses, and piecing together the fragmented evidence that remained. They discovered a trail of corruption and deceit, a conspiracy that reached far beyond Blackwood, implicating powerful figures in the Texas government and the law enforcement community. Their investigation led them to a hidden cache of documents, letters, and records that revealed the truth about the ambush. It had been deliberately orchestrated, a trap set by Blackwood in collusion with corrupt officials who wanted to silence Jack and his men, who were investigating their illegal activities. Armed with this evidence, Jack confronted Marshall Evans, presenting him with the irrefutable proof of his innocence and the widespread corruption that had led to the charges against him. Evans, initially skeptical, was forced to confront the truth, his own sense of justice warring with the pressures he was facing from his superiors. He realized that he had been manipulated, used as a pawn in a larger game, and that Jack was not the villain he had been led to believe. The final confrontation took place in the community hall of Redemption, the very symbol of the town's resilience and unity. The townsfolk gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of apprehension and hope, their fate hanging in the balance. Marshall Evans, his voice ringing with conviction, announced his findings, revealing the truth about Jack's past, the conspiracy that had led to the ambush, and the corruption that had permeated the Texas law enforcement community. He cleared Jack of all charges, declaring him a free man, a hero who had been unjustly accused and wrongly persecuted. A collective cheer erupted from the crowd, a wave of relief and jubilation washing over Redemption. Justice had prevailed, truth had triumphed, and the shadows of the past had been dispelled. The remaining allies of Blackwood, exposed and discredited, were rounded up and brought to justice, their power broken, their influence extinguished. Jack and Rosie, standing hand in hand, their faces beaming with joy and relief, looked out at the cheering crowd, their hearts filled with gratitude and love. They had faced their final confrontation, they had overcome adversity, and they had emerged victorious. The horizons of Redemption, once clouded by fear and uncertainty, were now clear and bright, filled with the promise of a new beginning, a future of peace, prosperity, and enduring love. The final confrontation had not been a battle of guns and violence, but a battle of hearts and minds, a battle for truth and justice, a battle that had been won by courage, resilience, and the unwavering power of love. The long journey was over, but the life they had built together, amongst a town that was once broken, was only just beginning. Epilogue. Years passed, and Redemption, once a dusty, forgotten frontier town, blossomed into a thriving community. The community hall, built on the ashes of the rusty spur, became the heart of the town, a place of laughter, celebration, and shared memories. Children played in the streets, families gathered for picnics, and the echoes of gunfire and violence faded into distant memory. Jack and Rosie, their love deepened by the trials they had faced, lived a life filled with peace, contentment, and the quiet joy of shared companionship. They built a home on the outskirts of town, a cozy ranch house surrounded by rolling hills and a vast, starlit sky. Jack, his past finally behind him, became a pillar of the community, a trusted advisor, a respected leader, and a symbol of hope and resilience. He never wore a badge again, but his sense of justice, his unwavering commitment to doing what was right, remained as strong as ever. Rosie, her dream fulfilled, continued to be the heart and soul of redemption. She ran the community hall with warmth and grace, her laughter echoing through its walls, her kindness touching the lives of everyone she met. Jed, ever loyal, remained their steadfast friend, his presence a constant reassurance, his strength a source of comfort. He became the unofficial guardian of redemption, his watchful eyes ensuring the safety and well-being of the town and its people. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape, Jack and Rosie sat on the porch of their ranch house, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude. They looked out at the town they had helped to rebuild, at the community they had nurtured, at the life they had created together. "We did it, Jack," Rosie said, her voice soft, her eyes sparkling with love. "We really did it." Jack nodded, his gaze meeting hers, his heart overflowing with emotion. "We did it together, Rosie," he said, his voice filled with tenderness. "We faced the darkness, and we found the light." They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the evening, the chirping of crickets, the distant murmur of voices, the gentle breeze rustling through the trees. The sky above them was a breathtaking spectacle, a vast expanse of darkness studded with millions of twinkling stars. As they watched, a shooting star streaked across the sky, a fleeting moment of brilliance, a symbol of hope, dreams, and the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. They had found their redemption, their peace, their forever, under the vast, unforgiving, yet ultimately beautiful, western sky. Their journey had been long and arduous, but it had led them to a place of love, belonging, and enduring happiness. A kiss before sundown had led to a lifetime of dawns, each one a testament to their resilience, their love, and the enduring spirit of the human heart.